And how's everyone doing? Enjoying their weekend? Perhaps. Maybe, maybe not. So where'd we leave off? Um, I feel like we left off probably at the merger. And so what's going on with that? It's approved, appealed. So anyone hear anything about G1 Quantum? No, because there's a value Department of Justice bias in addressing criminality. And what do I mean by that? What the Department of Justice does when someone that isn't in line with value, the pre-existing Warren Buffett wanting David Alger murdered in 9/11 and doing so through improperly formed monopoly of Berkshire Hathaway, that circumstance, when someone's not in line with that, they state an alternative set of facts to cover in satisfaction of the underlying criminality. And what do I mean by that? So what's going on, and where this is all derived from once more, is that I flagged a shadow banking and insider trading fraud involving Steve Cohen, Jamie Dimon, Steve Cohen taking advanced positions in GE and Comcast ahead of the NBC Universal GE Comcast merger. SR Intrinsic and other actions are filed by the SEC in satisfaction to cover that. Does that make sense? So there's this whole type of anonymity that the regulatory apparatus tries to create for people flagging fraud or addressing liability, but at the same time, the very regulatory apparatus that claims to want to protect people calling into question criminality, people that have outstanding liability owed, such as myself, that same regulatory apparatus doesn't care at all. It's all one big value charade scam. And what do I mean by that? Instead of addressing the multi-billion-dollar energy price fixing, commodity market manipulation, wire fraud liability owed to me regarding Time Warner Inc., leaving it there and not needing to redirect criminality in a merger for a year or so, what's gone on is that the DOJ and other lawmakers, officials, thought to themselves that they were promised a Facebook value social media strategy that would help affect the type of outcome that Randall, Stephenson and Jeffrey Bewkes wanted. And to an extent, that's what they got. They had a lot of constitutional contortionism, which you're seeing prevalent in the e-filing situation you have down in the Civil District, Criminal District Court in New York, Eastern District. When you have that type of criminality lingering on, what goes on is that it manifests and transforms and shape shifts into bigger liability, bigger constitutional fraud, because the underlying graft malversation and corruption is not addressed. Oh, it's getting addressed. It's just that you have to break it down at its highest, essentially the upper echelons of that type of criminal construct, and that involves Washington, D.C. And it's not to take away from Justice Leon's decision. It's just that when he's presented more facts than are stated by the DOJ is not stating the criminality that's been reported by myself. Doesn't that seem a little suspicious? Why is that? And then when you understand the underlying criminality situation where Warren Buffett wanted David Alger murdered, you understand these various layers, presumably to protect people calling into question criminality, but it's really not for that at all. It's just one big value market, Berkshire Hathaway, Microsoft-backed type of symbiotic relationship, rhino pachyderm type of situation where one cannot exist without the other. One is obsolete. Textile cannot exist without the tech type of backing to keep it existing. Does that make sense? So when someone's coming to the table turning $25 billion upside down solution or projects solar wall project, U.S.-Mexico border wall, turning that project from 25 billion right side up to 261 billion in its first year operation, paying for the wall. When someone has that ability and then also is able to break down the criminality going back to 9/11, and not only that, but then expose and break down the criminality within the DOJ, justices purposely neglecting criminality called into question to accommodate a poor baby rabbit value diamond sickness, you get to situations like this where it gets somewhat repetitive until the matter is addressed and the value entities are investigated, indicted, prosecuted, in prison for quite some time. Does that make sense? So we're on the precipice of that, but we're getting there. So understanding the merger, again, you have Randall Stephenson from AT&T wanting to buy Time Warner Inc. on account of me appealing decision on graft malversation and corruption at Andrew Cuomo downtown Manhattan Civil Court. And from there, you have that construct blocking and impairing and obstructing justice for me every step of the way. And understanding that, then you're able to see that, okay, well, Randall Stephenson was just doing more than trying to buy Time Warner Inc. He's trying to cover up his best friend, Jim Turley from Ernst & Young, who was cooking the books for Time Warner Inc. for quite some time, trying to cover up his shadow accounting fraud, which does somewhat similar criminality to Manafort, only washing money through Venezuela to then pay off value-based Middle Eastern entities in the Middle East to then create a perpetual state of war. And we're not to Manafort yet, but do you see the symmetry there? I do. So from there, do you understand that the DOJ is presenting an alternative set of facts similar to the Securities and Exchange Commission for out of value bias to never have to formally address the underlying criminality head on, and that criminality, that strategy is supported by a social media, predominantly Facebook strategy, which wishes to confuse, compound, and has been given access or is illegally obtaining access with the DOJ overlooking or looking the other way to execute and support those strategies. So, does everyone see that? You have Time Warner is to Jim Turley as you have Russia is to Paul Manafort. There we go. That kind of ties it together, right? So let's now aside from Michael Cohen being paid millions of dollars for the Trump administration to publicly denounce the merger while at the same time trying to prove it, not purposely neglecting the criminality called into question, Jamie Dimon, the White House, the poor baby value, rabbit diamond sickness issues, the wire fraud, the sense of entitlement, that whole merger fraud is now being appealed, where now I'll be filing third-party complaint in D.C. Circuit Court, making sure that the liability to myself is addressed. And perhaps maybe I don't get Time Warner Inc., but should anyone? You know, it was a strategy so AT&T could redirect fraud for Ernst & Young. It broke down. They had to constitutionally contort it, Cuomo contortion it, to this extent, and it makes Justice Leon, questions the integrity of his office, wouldn't you say, at the very least? So you have that issue, and then the whole other issue, because that narrative of the merger wasn't quite enough to carry on for this long. You have the criminal trial of Paul Manafort coming up. So Paul Manafort is another interesting circumstance that also relates back to this situation. So what's going on in 2016 before that, and more prevalently after 2011, you have an increase in the amount of value-based LLCs out of Southampton, Cypriot, other international LLCs created by Paul Manafort, others, to then wash money overseas in the type of shadow banking context. So we went from shadow accounting, Ernst & Young to now shadow banking Jamie Dimon, the Burmese junta. So what's going on there is that unknown to a majority of the United States and the public, that a majority of politics is centrally based out of a Southampton criminal nexus, Cuomo contortionism, which probably isn't very readily known outside of New York. So from there, you have a type of nexus that feels entitled to defraud the public, presented a false choice, and that type of lingering fake news type of issue. So Paul Manafort's an interesting situation because Mueller is now given by the international, the type of international community and the intelligence community, has been entrusted to an extent by the international community and intelligence community to go ahead and present the public in the United States this narrative of Manafort in Russia. So by the time anyone walks in to the trial for Paul Manafort, everyone's thinking that he's guilty, and I'm not calling into question his criminality or him being involved in his involvement or the DOJ's prosecution or Mueller's investigation. I'm merely saying that value has watched Paul Manafort for a very long time, from beginning in early 2000s to 2011, the uptick to now. And instead of saying Jamie Dimon was giving Burma, Myanmar accounts of JP Morgan Chase, and then JP Morgan Chase was washing money for Jamie Dimon to then be reinfused into Andrew Cuomo's campaign for 2018 and Donald Trump's campaign for 2016, instead of saying that, Mueller federally for value, to cover up and accommodate the value criminality, he presents the public the investigation of just Manafort in Russia to then limit the value scope of the prosecution to cover up and accommodate criminality ranging and involving Jamie Dimon, Warren Buffett, and the issue where we first began exposing shadow banking and insider trading fraud. So did I put that all together for you? On one hand, you have Michael Cohen being paid millions of dollars, Trump's lawyer, to publicly denounce the merger while behind the closed doors backing it, trying to cover up hundreds of billions of dollars in criminality. And on the other hand, you have shadow banking fraud where Jamie Dimon can't contribute enough to people, the establishment, value-based establishment, Democratic, Republican, to get away with his criminality. So instead of going over the maximum and then being held criminally responsible, what goes on is that shadow accounting provisions are made on the balance sheet for different types of entities that essentially the administration looks the other way, while Mnuchin focuses on Russia. And Mueller focuses in on Russia to confuse and compound and redirect the criminality from the public and the marketplace. Does that make sense? Because if Jamie Dimon's name is in the news for fleeing the country, shadow banking, insider trading, wire fraud, wire dragnets, Laura Diamond, Daily News, wire dragnets, feeling entitled to legally monitor people, that doesn't look as good as Mueller, Manafort, in Russia, right? So you can see there's a whole perception, deception, false choice, and in redirecting criminality. So, again, one hand you have Jeffrey Bewkes, who's the CEO of Time Warner Inc., employing Andrew Cuomo's brother Chris Cuomo at CNN, and Cynthia Nixon, who also works at Sex and the City, and an election rigging on that extent for governor of New York, which money has all been funneled through and laundered by Paul Manafort and value-based entities quite some time in advance, with Mueller and the federal regulatory apparatus purposefully wishing to redirect the value-based criminality handed down, which directives handed down through the intelligence community in the United States, to then present the public in only Mueller, Russia, Manafort, criminality or criminal context, when in reality the scope of the prosecution should be several orders of magnitude larger than just Paul Manafort, Russia, and the Mueller charade in redirecting the value criminality to limit the scope of the prosecution. Does that make sense? So you have shadow accounting fraud in Venezuela, going back to Ernst & Young, Jim Turley, Randall, Stephenson, covering up for his friend, cooking the books, Ernst & Young for Time Warner Inc., laundering money into the Middle East for value-based Middle Eastern entities to perpetuate a constant state of war in the Middle East, to confuse and compound and allow Time Warner Inc. to create those narratives to essentially defraud the public with respect to international community and international relations. And on that end, yeah, that merger, fraud to redirect and confuse and compound, and again, not address the liability owed to myself, my company. And on the other end, you have Mueller, Manafort, and Mueller being entrusted by an intelligence community in the United States to present the public one federal narrative of Manafort in Russia, when in actuality, you have a whole type of value criminal nexus that has been ongoing since early 2000 and now uptick in 2011, where you have different types of international LLCs being used as mechanisms to then wash money for different types of political affiliations to affect different types of outcomes. And one of those outcomes now is to get away with wire fraud, wire dragnets that failed, that manifest into wire dragnets with the intent to entrap and murder that have been ongoing for 7 years. So instead of dealing with Jamie Dimon, Laura Dimon, the Daily News, different types of people that were affording shadow accounting, shadow banking entities space on the balance sheet, instead of addressing that criminality, Mueller, and in line with the value Facebook social media sickness strategy handed down from the intelligence community, then tries to present the public a false choice on that criminality, which arrives and brings us to Monday. So moving forward, how we deal with this issue is that, yes, I made all the filings I needed to for the merger and the criminality in question to be addressed, but they didn't want to address it. So fool me once, shame on you. Fool me again, shame on me, right? So we're moving forward, amicus brief, certiorari, third-party complaints to resolve this issue in its totality and bring to light the constitutional contortionism of downtown, the civil and criminal district, where the criminality and the strategies that have gone into that have essentially backed the Cuomo value-based contortionism into a corner of their own doing, and now they can't figure a way out of it. So interesting how that all interplays.